The LA Clippers have many decisions to make this offseason, and the future of Paul George is one of them. And with talk and chatter growing louder around the league, how likely is it that Paul George is actually going to be traded? And with the New York Knicks seeming to try to make a move for him, what do we think of their packages? Going to be joined by Gavin from the Locked On Knicks podcast to talk about all things Paul George on today's Locked On Clippers.
You are Locked On Clippers, your daily Los Angeles Clippers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, guys, as promised, we are joined by Darian Vaziri. He is the host of the Locked On Clippers podcast, and you could check out his work on the, sorry, it was Dime Dropper. Okay, I'll bring us back in. 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, as promised, we are joined by the fantastic host of the Locked On Clippers podcast and the Dime Dropper YouTube channel. It is Darian Vaziri. You can check out the Dime Dropper YouTube channel for NBA history content, including plenty of stuff on the New York Knicks. But Darian, we are right smack dab in the middle of the present because Paul George is potentially on the block. There was a report first from Locked On Zone, Howard Beck on this podcast, and a couple others that Paul George might be available and that certain teams might be discussing potential deals with the Clippers, and the Clippers are putting that out there. Mark Stein reiterated that, saying that the Clippers gave rival teams the impression that they were gauging George's value prior to the NBA draft. And then we had SNY's Ian Begley saying the Knicks and Clippers have had contact about a potential Paul George trade. Some other reporters, including Andrew Grief of the LA Times, threw a little bit of cold water on that. But Darian, I say all that to say welcome, and I hope our two teams can make a great deal for Paul George because I love the guy. But first of all, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. It's honestly a pleasure. Locked On Knicks. I always say the Knicks have the best fans in basketball, but I can't say that too loud. My Clipper fans are going to get mad at me, but I've been to a Knicks game, and it was pretty unforgettable during the 2013 Knicks tape Knicks with Melo in his prime. Whoa. It was a fun time.
I'm jealous. I did not get to go to a game that year. I was in high school, but I was enjoying every single. Oh, cool. All right. Well, we got to talk more about that after. All right. I was enjoying every single moment of it, but I guess where I want to start off, I guess I know it'd be weird to trade the guy that Brandon Miller called the GOAT, but let's just say 1 to 10 scale. How likely do you think it is that Paul George gets traded anywhere this summer?
2. I think that it's very unlikely, to be honest. Howard Beck actually said the same thing on my show when he came on, and he said the first time he came on, he said that they're going to run it back. And after the Game 5 against the Suns when we got eliminated, Lawrence Frank straight up said, our plan is to continue with Kawhi and Paul George. Now, if they were to rebuild or retool, I don't think he'd say it right after this playoffs ends. I think that's his job, to keep the 2 stars that he's paying so much money, or that we're paying so much money, invested and feel like they're part of the plans going forward, even if they're not. But they were obviously going to take some time to think about it. And the second time Howard Beck came on our show, he said that it's not out of the realm of possibility that Paul George could be traded if the right offer is there for the Clippers, which honestly I was happy to hear, just because I wanted to see that the Clippers weren't just staying stagnant and actually hearing teams out. But in my opinion, the likelihood of the Clippers trading Paul George is not very high, because I don't think they're going to get a return that they like. And from everything I've heard, people are only talking about Paul George, not Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. So if you want to keep Kawhi Leonard on the team and still be a win now team, why would you trade away Paul George? Who are you getting that's going to be even close to his value? I understand if you want to get, a bunch of picks and smaller young players, smaller pieces that are young players or whatnot, like Obi Toppin or like RJ Barrett, that aren't stars right now. But those guys with Kawhi Leonard, does that make us closer to a championship team? I personally don't think so. I don't think a player like RJ Barrett or Anthony Simons, or even the 3rd pick in the draft, who, by the way, I would take Scoot Henderson, but I don't think they would be good enough right away to be the second best player on a championship team. Paul George, granted, I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but he's closer than the guys we'd be getting. So I don't think that they would do it. if I had to put my money on it. And especially the fact that we tried to trade for Malcolm Brogdon. Malcolm Brogdon seems like someone you bring in to help Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, not to go a different direction. So I would give it a 2. Very unlikely, in my opinion.
So I tend to agree with you, right? Because I think we all do these podcasts and we like to talk about, all right, which stars our team going to trade for? Which stars our team going to trade for? The teams that have them want those guys. Everybody wants those guys. The whole world wants Paul George. But if we can play devil's advocate for just a second, the road the Clippers walk down when they say, hey, we worked so hard for this. We traded away Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. We traded away all these picks. This was the biggest win. I think you would agree with this in the history of the entire franchise, that these two guys decided to come here where they were born, geography be damned. They made the decision to say, hey, we're not going to be Lakers. We're both going to be Clippers, and we're going to bring glory. And I would argue, maybe you would argue too, that with better injury luck, that might have already happened for the Clippers. Heck, I think if Kawhi, I say this as someone who roots for the Suns, if Kawhi Leonard had stayed healthy, I think they would have beaten the Suns this year. Maybe they would have given the Nuggets a better series than anyone else if Paul George had come back. And that's a great reason to say, even for one more year, let's run it back. But I got to ask you, how much of an appetite do the Clippers have when Paul George's agent and Kawhi Leonard's agent walk into Lawrence Frank's office and say, hey, we want max extensions for our guys, 4 years, $220 million. I know they haven't played a whole lot the last few years, but they're really good, and we'd like all that money, please. Like, is Lawrence Frank thinking about that scenario? Would he push back on that scenario? And could a breakdown there lead to that 2 becoming more like a, I don't know, 5 or a 6?
I think that is the one avenue where it could be elevated to a 5 or a 6, because from everything I've heard, the Clippers are extremely hesitant to give those guys extensions, and for good reason. I'm not going to lie. I would not want them to get extensions personally as a fan, and I also wouldn't give it to them. But my question is, are they still like down to leave? You know, I understand playing hardball, but still down to leave where they chose to go, their home, as you said. That's the thing. But absolutely, if Paul George or Kawhi don't get the extensions, that could make talks a little bit louder. I would say yes.
I think I tend to agree with you. And I guess the follow-up question there is, if there's a world where they say, all right, then trade us somewhere else, who is willing to give them that type of money? And that was part of the hesitancy, according to Andrew Grief on the Knicks part. He said after some internal discussions, the Knicks have become hesitant about acquiring George. The Knicks also think George's representatives will ask for a contract extension. Of course they will. And if you're the Knicks, you have to say, all right, how comfortable are we paying this guy through his age 37 season? We're now, over the last 4 years, he hasn't topped 56 games once, and he's averaged 47 games a year as a Clipper. I think there are still good arguments for why the Knicks would want to go all in on him, and we will talk about that in just a sec. But before we do that, I want to quickly mention our friends over at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage and look for the green check to know how the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game. When you shop on eBay Motors, and with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only, and exclusions do apply. All right, I want to talk a little bit about what Paul George's future is like, because whether it's Clippers paying him, it's the Knicks paying him, someone else paying him, I think the number one thing you look at is the injuries. I just, before the break, we outlined how many games he's played recently. I guess the main thing I want to know, do you think this is a case of his body breaking down, or is it 4 years of bad luck for Paul George?
A little bit of both. I think there has been bad luck, like the Lou Dort injury this season. It was just bad luck, but also like there was a listener that was, you know, a bio mechanist and stuff, and was, you know, talking to me about something she noticed about his body when she went to a game and sat up close and said that his foundation is not very strong, like for an NBA player. And so that he is, his likelihood of injury is fairly high with his knees and stuff like that, with awkward landings. So, and I mean, remember when he broke his leg? Like this, it's not like this guy has no history, came to the Clippers with no history of injury. If you look at the games played, yes, he was a lot healthier before he was a Clipper, but that also has to do with we didn't do load management like that league wide before like 2019 or something. So a lot of things go into it, but I wouldn't even say his body's necessarily breaking down. I just think he's older and he's more prone to injury naturally. And yeah, you don't get healthier as you age. I don't think. I mean, Chris Paul kind of did with that vegan diet or whatever. But yeah, Paul George is going to be in my opinion, he's kind of an injury waiting to happen personally. But hey, he's still a great player. And the one thing I'll give him, when he comes back from injury, it doesn't take him that long to get back to being Paul George. Sometimes he comes back and like the first game he's back, it's like, oh, didn't even, as if he hadn't even been out. So that's one thing that's really good about him.
So this is where I push back, because on some, not on you, but on people in our comment section, when we talk about Paul George, people are like, he's old, he's 33. Why are we giving up stuff for him? This is ridiculous. And I'll kind of reiterate what I'll always reiterate, which is it's hard to get the perfect star because those guys generally aren't available. Those guys are generally pretty happy in those situations, and teams don't really give them up unless you're going all in like a Kevin Durant scenario. And we saw even with that, there were some age-related concerns. There were some slight slippage concerns. Like you trade for the one that you can get. And also the fact that Paul George on the Clippers, like this is arguably, obviously the final Oklahoma City year, right? Probably the best individual season of his career. But you can argue these last 4 years, 5 years, if you want to include that, are better than he's ever been. You would think, right, it was when in his mid-20s to late 20s, that is generally when guys peak. But he's had 3 of the 4 best effective field goal percentages of his career. He had previously, before his last 3 years on the Clippers, he'd never averaged more than 4.1 assists per game. The last 3 years, he's averaged 5.2, 5.7, 5.1. Great rebounding numbers. Better three-point shooting than he's had for a good chunk of his career. Not the last 2 years, but the 2 years before that. He was shooting the lights out. It feels like in certain ways he's peaking as a player. How have you seen him evolve over his 4 years on the Clippers?
That's a good question. The first season, he was out a lot. He never really gained his footing. And I thought that he, at times in the playoffs, still dribbled a little too much, and like he did in the playoffs against Portland. And then it was kind of interesting. Going into the next season, when we got Ty Lue, he went on All the Smoke, and he was saying that Glenn Rivers used him as a coming off pin downs guy, or just like kind of used him as like a Ray Allen, or he even said like a JJ Redick type. But somebody showed some of the numbers, and apparently he wasn't that much more off ball than he was in that 2019 season that you referenced earlier, which was his best regular season of his career. So I thought he was just full of it, Paul George. Just coming after the bubble. Everybody was grilling him for making a lot of excuses and all that. But Ty Lue, in that season, we had Patrick Beverley as our point guard and then Reggie Jackson as our point guard. So no one that's a true playmaker out of those two. So what we did was we put the ball in Kawhi Leonard and Paul George's hands more. And I was like, he dribbles too much. I don't really trust him. Putting the ball in his hands more. But you know what? It really worked, because more than anything, it gave him that confidence back. And after the bubble, his confidence was really low. He had just been knocked out in 3 disappointing fashions in a row, with the 2 years in OKC, and then the bubble, which was the all-time low for him. And the next year, I thought he grew as a playmaker, and I thought he didn't over dribble as much at all. And then in the playoffs, he seemed like he overcame a lot of demons and had a fantastic playoff run. I think that might have been the best playoff run of his entire career, even greater than the 2014 Eastern Conference Finals run as the number 1 seed with Indiana. I mean, he made history for us. Like, nobody had made it past the second round in 50 years. I had to hear that my whole life growing up. And Paul George, without Kawhi Leonard, Game 5 in one of the toughest places to play in the NBA, Utah, 38 points, I believe it was. Big shot after big shot. I mean, it was incredible. And then 2022, I'd say you got the same guy there with that confidence that he left off in the 2021 playoffs. And his defense was actually even a little bit sharper off the ball. I don't think that's something he got better at. I think that was just the way he was playing that season. He's always a pretty solid in the passing lanes kind of player, but 2022, he really was active with his hands. And then this season, about the same. I'd say Paul George has gotten to his peak. I think 2021 he peaked, and now he's kind of on the decline a little bit, but that's normal. He's still a star player and will be a star player. I think for at least this season and the season after, he will still be a guy that can drop 24 points in his sleep. Like, it's funny, he averaged 23 points, and it feels like he can do so much more. That's how easy it is for him to score that much.
Yeah, I will quote the great Zach Lowe, who's fond of saying Paul George is a boss. I've always kind of been of the same opinion. I think his reputation's gotten muddled at points because, like, early in his career, like, it was LeBron and the Heat getting the better of him. Then he was on the wrong end of that very famous Damian Lillard shot. And then you had the Nuggets series in the bubble, where I think both him and Kawhi both took a bad rep. But the guy, like, I think there's a reason why people were, in Clipperland, so excited when those two paired up. And in other parts of the NBA, like, a little bit fearful. And you're like, wow, you have two of the, I don't know. I always find it weird when people say two-way players, because it's like, if someone's way better on offense, like, are they a better two-way player, quote unquote? Doesn't it just matter who the better player is? But talking about quote unquote two-way guys, like, two of the 3, 4, 5 best in the NBA. Both those guys are monsters. And if you're LA, that's why you want to keep him. If you're New York, that's why you want to go get him. And I've kind of referenced him on our podcast for maybe 5 years running now as sort of the archetype of star that the Knicks need. And now that they're seemingly on the precipice of real contention, that feels even more urgent. And I don't know. I don't know how much Knicks you got to watch this year, but let me know if you agree with it. I think, again, if that deal's centered around RJ Barrett, even if it's centered around Julius Randle for whatever reason, if the Clippers are like, let's retool over someone who at least plays a little bit more than Paul George, even if it lowers our ceiling, right? Hypothetically, like, he just slots in so well compared to either of those guys as someone who is a more proactive passer and just a far better shooter. And to me, that is everything, because we saw Jalen Brunson on 1 foot scoring 41 points, somehow jitterbugging his way through 3-4 defenders at a time. I think with Paul George, and I'm curious the effect you feel like he's had on Kawhi when both those guys are on the floor, Jalen Brunson wouldn't have to do that.
Oh, if I'm looking at it from a Knicks perspective, it's amazing. I'm not saying it makes you a championship team, but oh my God, it makes you, like, I think you could reach the conference finals. Like, Jalen, as you said, it's the perfect player for the Knicks. The thing is, some of my people on, like, one of the people on my team from my own channel and people that I've come into contact with, straight up New Yorkers, like Knicks fans in New York right now, making their own content. So I'm not saying I watched a ton of the Knicks, but I'm pretty tapped in. And, like, Jalen Brunson was unbelievable this season. Paul George would be exactly what the Knicks need. I think if you put Kawhi on the Knicks, you guys are a championship contender, like, right away, straight up.
I'll take him if you guys are throwing him out.
I don't think we are, but yeah. Paul George, absolutely would be amazing. I think he'd be a perfect player for the Knicks. Like, that's a team that he could go to. I think he'd be the best scorer on the team. I think based on the availability of Brunson and the way he played and the fact that he's probably only going to get better, I honestly think, as crazy, I can't believe I'm saying that Brunson could be better than Paul George, but I don't know. Going forward, with health included, we'll see. When healthy, probably not. But Paul George, the thing about P is, he's, for a star, he's so inconsistent. He's so inconsistent, like, especially with his offense. And his defense, it's always decent at the worst, but it's not always good or great like you'd expect. When he's missing shots, he's just normal. He's just a guy that's in his own head a lot for a star. Like, I'll give you an example. We get on this a lot here.
Sure.
Kawhi, when he doesn't play, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George needs to be taking 20 shots per game, minimum. Sometimes he'll, like, go out there and shoot 13 shots and shoot 7 for 13. And we're like, dude, like, what are you doing? Like, you are Paul George. They cannot guard you. And it's sometimes like he has to be told he's that guy. And if you listen to his own Podcast P, he went out there and straight up admitted, or I think it was Reddick's podcast, but he reiterates it. Yeah. I'm not a number one on a championship team. He said it straight up. So that's not necessarily a guy that seems like he's exuding a ton of confidence, but he would absolutely help the Knicks, and he still has a ton of redeeming qualities, and he definitely cares. You know, he wants to win a ring. Sometimes he doesn't always show it with how, like, locked in he is, but he really does care.
Yeah, I think it's this weird duality with him, right? Because you just pointed out the game that he had against the Jazz. And in my mind, I think of him as a killer, but it hasn't been there every playoffs, every game. But that's like when I'm thinking about this trade from a Knicks perspective, I'm just thinking about ceiling, right? Like, what is the best case scenario with those two guys? And the thing with Brunson is, like, he who knows? Maybe he flops next postseason and we have a new discussion. But you look at what he did against the Jazz as the number one guy in the Mavs 2 years ago. Look at what he was doing against the Heat, like a team that ultimately proved to be probably the best defense in the NBA when it was all said and done, without a lot of help. And he was ripping them to shreds. And then you have guys like, maybe someone would be in this trade, but like Grimes, Quickly, and Barrett that are improving. You have a real defensive infrastructure if you add Paul George to Mitchell Robinson and Quentin Grimes. Those are three guys that on the right night in the right setting could qualify as all NBA type of defenders. I'm not saying the Knicks would be the favorite to win a championship, but shouldn't what Miami did this year give you some hope as a Knicks fan that that's a possibility, that that's on the table? And you're making that kind of trade for a chance, even if it's a small one. And maybe on the flip side, the Clippers would have the same argument towards keeping him. We can get into that in just a sec. We are going to step aside one final time, but when we return, we'll talk about the Clippers' perspective on this a little bit and what the trade would look like with the New York Knicks if it would indeed happen. All right, we are back on Locked On Knicks talking Paul George. What do you think? What is the best case scenario here for the Los Angeles Clippers? Because you were kind of referencing it earlier, like that it's, let me know if this was the wrong takeaway, but almost as if it's not the end of the world if they don't get a contract extension done before the season. And if this is just one more year of them going all in, is there an appetite for that in Clipperland with what I assume is just so much frustration at the inability to have Paul and Kawhi healthy at the same time?
You asking about the fans?
I'm just like, what's your perspective? What do you think the front office's perspective is on it?
I think the front office's perspective is to give him another chance, just to cross their fingers and get it right.
Yeah.
And I think that it would have to be a really strong deal with either a ton of first round picks or a player that they believe is either on the trajectory of being a star or is a star right now. So that would be my answer to that.
And I guess from a Knicks perspective, what do you think that deal would potentially look like? Because I think the Knicks would be coming at it at a very similar angle as the Clippers, where, I mean, I think we could almost just go off that Andrew Grief report. They wouldn't be totally inclined to just say, oh, here, we're going to throw you the 4 years, $220 million. They might get a little bit into the season, see how things look. But they would have to strike that balance, right, of giving the Clippers, to your point with Kawhi, a deal where they could say, all right, we could be better for this, or at the very least, we think we're going to be healthy come playoff time with this, and we could theoretically beat the Nuggets, but at the same time, not giving up too much that the Knicks lose that championship contention. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, it definitely is. I just think, so you're asking me like, what would be the trade that I would listen to with New York? Mm-hmm. I mean, see, I'm not going to lie, Gavin. I just don't know if there's anything that the Knicks have that interests me that much, except for, you're not going to give us Brunson. I mean, I would absolutely love Brunson.
No,
so that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, trading Paul George for a package centered around Randall, like that just doesn't interest me much. I think Randall's hit his ceiling.
Yeah.
And I don't think that he's going to get much better. I don't think he'll ever have a season better than 2021, but he was really solid this year. I still think the Knicks are better when he plays, but I don't think Randall, as most Knicks fans, I think would tend to agree, is not the second best player or first best player on a championship team. I think maybe he could be third, but he has his moments, Julius, right now. I'm going to just leave it at that.
Yeah.
I do like some of your other young complementary pieces like Quentin Grimes, Deuce McBride, Quickly, like these guys that defend and, are athletic guards. But for someone like Paul George, I just don't know. Then there's obvious a package centered around Barrett and Obi Toppin. And I you know what? If you had asked me a year ago, I'd say I would listen to that because of, I wasn't as willing to move Paul George last year, but I was higher on RJ Barrett last year because he had a couple of games against LA teams where he went off, and you could see that he had added like this bully ball aspect to his game against smaller guards, and he had a nice little floater and was really good, obviously, when he gets to a strong left hand finishing around the basket, but his jumper hasn't really made big-time strides to me, and he doesn't look like a player that I don't know if he'll ever be able to consistently create his own shot off the dribble. And that's where I now have hesitation saying that RJ is going to be a future star. And defensively, I think he's solid, but you can probably tell me that more. It's not anything great that I've noticed. I remember he guarded Kawhi Leonard really well one game that you guys beat us.
I remember that game. It was his second year. Yeah.
But I think I got too high on him as a defender because of that game. Like some of my Knicks friends will say he's terrible. Some will say that he's okay at defense. I mean, let me ask you what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because I have, And he has a weird tendency to get off to inexplicably just horrific starts to seasons, right? It's been every year of his career. I thought his third season was the nadir of that. This year at points was somehow even worse, where it just looked like someone had monstered him and he completely forgot how to play basketball. And then he improved, and then he had down stretches again. And you were just looking at a guy and you were kind of saying, all right, at the end of the day, this is who he is. He's super inconsistent. He sometimes makes really bad decisions on both ends of the floor. Defensively, I thought that maybe was somehow the biggest disappointment this year, which is crazy because there was a point where he was shooting like 16% from three over the first 30 games of the year. But the defense was just so bad. It was lazy. He was getting back cut. It looked like he had cinder blocks on his feet. And then inexplicably, towards the end of the year, started getting better and better and better and better. And even some nights when the shooting wasn't there, you started noticing that he was driving to pass, which was this big, mind-blowing revelation with RJ, because that's what you were dying to see out of him, but you just would never quite get there. And then all of a sudden he started doing it. And in the fire of the playoffs, I was like, I had a bold prediction after the All-Star break. I thought he would be moved to the bench in the playoffs because he was just a liability. And then he played the best basketball of his life this postseason. He was shooting it better. He was defending fantastically with great effort, forcing live ball turnovers, dominant in transition, bullying mismatches in the half court. And you look at the numbers at the end of the day, and the efficiency still wasn't incredible, but the process was so good, and it would give you hope. And I'm not going to argue that he should be the centerpiece of a Paul George trade if the Clippers' goal is to win now. But in a world where the Clippers decide, maybe not this offseason, but 20 games into a year, if there's and I'm obviously not rooting for this, but there's another injury to Kawhi Leonard, if there's an injury where Paul's missing 20 games and Steve Ballmer just comes down and he says, all right, screw this. I'm done. This is too much. Do you think there's a world where that happens? Because ultimately I'm on the same page as you. I just don't think the Clippers have an incentive to get this done when they could still argue, hey, we're just waiting for the stars to align. We can win a title. And let's go back. You referenced that Paul George against the Jazz series. I think the Clippers win the championship that year if Kawhi Leonard's healthy. I've almost never seen someone play better basketball than he did against the Mavs that season. And then he gets hurt, and then it all goes up in smoke. But they might have won that year. I think they were better than Phoenix. They probably were a little bit more battle-tested than Milwaukee. I say that to say there is a fantastic argument for the Clippers just running it back, but are they one injury away from that no longer being the case, or do you think this is a discussion that fully gets pushed to next offseason?
So I think the likelihood of Paul George getting traded in the middle of the season is only if they're blowing it up because of an injury. So then both are traded. I do not think they would never just trade one of them and put the other one on an island for the rest of the season with no training camp, with this new, these new players coming in. They would not do that. So they would have to decide to blow it up in the middle of the season. And I think the only possibility of that is if both get injured at the same time. Again, kind of like we had in these playoffs this year. So that's my only possibility of that. I mean, as far as the Knicks package, yeah, I'm not going to lie. I would, in a scenario that you guys had something that I really wanted, I'd be down to see the Knicks get better and Paul George go to a home like that where he'd instantly be contending. But there's just nothing to me that interests me from your side. No offense. But, that's how I feel about doing business with the Knicks. Unless, what's your pick situation? If you throw a bunch of first rounders at us, and I think and get some of those back to be traded to Oklahoma City, I'd be more willing to listen.
Yeah, so I think that would be a big part of it. And the question would be how many of those picks, because the Knicks have a surplus of 4 picks. The value of those picks is questionable, right? Because they are all Milwaukee's top 5 protected. The Wizards one might now never convey as a first if they want to really suck the next 3 seasons. The Pistons one is protected pretty decently the next 2 years. And then the Mavs one should convey next year, but who knows with how that team is run. And then the Knicks have their own picks to trade. So I think in a world where the Clippers did decide to trade both of them, one, maybe the Knicks are going all in on Kawhi Leonard and not Paul George. And 2, I think they would be one of the favorites to go get Paul. But I guess I got to finish on this. After this whole conversation, I'm a little mystified. Why do you think Paul George's name has been coming up? Do you think there just wasn't that much credibility to those reports? Do you think it was the Clippers trying to angle for Scoot specifically from Portland? Because it seems like at the very least, some members of the Clippers front office are really considering this.
It's funny. I actually did an episode on this exact topic a couple days ago, and I think one of them is the new CBA. I think they realize how capped they are. That two guys, one of which is, and Kawhi Leonard is the best player on this team. Like, make no mistake, everyone knows that. But Paul George gets paid the same amount as him, and the fact I think that they realize, like, should we really put all our faith in this guy? That he has an injury history, but even when he's healthy, sometimes he doesn't give you everything that you want. And that's something that I think they are considering as well, because we have the new stadium opening up, not this upcoming season, but next season. And I think they're thinking, if we want to go a different route, maybe start showing the fans that can look positive before you open up a new stadium. Because if you want to open up a new stadium and let's say they're totally rebuilding next year, I mean, trying to draw, I think Clipper fans will still show up to their new arena, obviously, no matter who's playing. But for all the casual fans in LA to check out the new stadium, it's not going to be as big of a draw if like Bones Highland, Terrence Mann, and Brandon Boston are headlining your new stadium on opening night, as opposed to your stars. So I think they're starting to think, if we're going to make a move, maybe we make it now, especially with the new CBA, which is, I think, the main reason why they're starting to consider other options.
Wow, Jason Preston slander not getting thrown in there as
Jason Preston,
one of the headliners.
I'm down for Jason Preston minutes.
Our fellow journalist, man. We gotta honor him a little.
I like
bit.
Jason Preston.
Yeah, he's cool. I liked him in college. All right. Anyways, that's it, man. Thank you so much for doing this. Before I let you go, can you just tell everyone one final time where they can find all your great work?
Yes, thank you so much. I love it. Always love talking to Knicks fans, some of those passionate fans in the game. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at DimeDropperPod. I talk about all sorts of NBA history, nut. Huge fan of the 70s Knicks. I make content on them on my channel. I made that video on the Willis Reed game. By the way, shout out to Willis Reed. It was his birthday on Sunday. Would have been 81 years old. So made a lot of content on those guys. Clyde Frazier, who I absolutely adore. And yeah, so if you want to check that stuff out, like I make some film breakdowns of the past, and obviously during the playoffs, I went live every single night of the playoffs, talk about the games. And I often go live with Knicks fans all the time. So check me out on there. And yeah, Gavin, thanks so much for having me. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for doing it. Yeah, hopefully can be one of those Knicks fans one day, because you do great work. And even if you bum me out a little bit with your Paul George to the Knicks pessimism, I will keep talking about it, because I love the guy and I want him to be on the Knicks one day. But until then, we will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Locked On Knicks, with plenty more trade episodes.
And Locked On Clippers, don't forget.
And Locked On Clippers. Yeah. And for Knicks fans, if you want to get the latest on Paul George and where he might end up, subscribe to Locked On Clippers wherever you get podcasts, whether that be on YouTube or on the audio side, because you'll get the best information, the latest information 5 days a week. But until then, we'll talk to you soon. All right, sweet. Thanks so much, man.